Hey guys, I'm Brett Pike and it's time to talk homeschool. And specifically we're going to talk about teaching children Latin. Now the first question people would ask is, why would we teach children a language that no one speaks? Why would we teach them something called a dead language? Well, the reason is that 50% of English grammatical structure and 50% of English vocabulary derives from Latin. So if you have a command of Latin from a young age, you have a much more thorough command of English. And when you talk about a test like the SATs, and don't get me wrong, I'm not a college thumper. In fact, I'm kind of hoping my children don't go to college, but it's just a good example. When you talk about the English section of the SATs, a child that has a comprehensive understanding of Latin will score well on that test, because even if they come across vocabulary that they're not familiar with, they'll be able to figure out the meaning of those words just by knowing the Latin roots of English. So understanding Latin is a very powerful skill. A lot of parents are passionate about it. They don't know where to get started. That's what we're here to talk about today. So with that being said, let's just get right into it. And as always with language, the earlier you start, the better, because children's minds are like little sponges. We can go to Italy or France, you and I, and we can stay there for 20 years and we won't pick up the language nearly as well as a newborn child in just 5 years, because the young mind is a sponge made to absorb language. So the earlier we start, the better. But if you didn't start at age 3 or 4, that's fine. In fact, with a classical education, many students start Latin right around 3rd and 4th grade. And here are a few really good resources that you can use for your 3rd or 4th grader to introduce them to Latin. And the books that I like are The Big Book of Lively Latin, Prima Latina, and Latina Christiana. And these books are particularly effective because they teach using a parts to whole strategy, which when we teach language, in my opinion, is the way to go. And it's the idea that you start with the most basic parts of language and then you build out to the more complex entire system of language. So for example, you teach children how to identify verbs, nouns, or how is a verb presented in Latin? How is a noun presented in Latin? How is a pronoun presented in Latin? And of course, in Latin-derived languages, it has to do with the masculine and the feminine. So if it's masculine, there's an O on the end. If it's feminine, there's an A on the end. And by teaching children parts to whole, they understand the rules of language, and they'll have a much better understanding as it starts to get more complex. Now, speaking of the masculine and feminine, many of you are familiar, that I'm sure everyone's familiar, that a language like Spanish or Italian uses that same concept. That's because the Romance languages derive from Latin. So English, French, Italian, Romanian, all of these languages are easier to learn once your child knows Latin. So once they get that root, it's reasonable to think that later on, if they want to go that route, if they want to apply themselves, they could learn Spanish, Italian, French, Romanian. They have the ability to do that because they will understand the root. So again, the books I like, The Big Book of Lively Latin, Prima Latina, and Latina Christiana 1. And these books are great because they use the parts to whole strategy. They start with the rules of language, pronouns, verbs, nouns. They use flashcards, they start working on vocabulary, and they keep things fun. So for anyone out there interested in teaching your children Latin, these are a few good resources to get started with. Like I said, classical education often starts around 3rd or 4th grade. So if you have a child that isn't that old yet, you might not have to worry about it quite yet. Or if you have a child in 3rd or 4th grade, use these books to get started. And if you have a child that's a little older, that's okay too. It's not too late. A 5th, a 6th grader, you can introduce Latin and I'm sure they will pick it up just fine. Let me know what you think in the comments. Let me know if you have any questions. I am going to go through the questions and make response videos and hopefully answer them to the best of my ability. And for anyone interested in what I do, for those of you that don't know, I'm the founder of the Classical Learner Homeschooling Company. All members of Homeschools Connected get access to all of our lesson plans, unit studies, pre-recorded courses, live courses that I teach myself, as well as our amazing community. So check that out. And if you could, hit the subscribe button, like, share, comment. This really helps me out. Thanks for being here, and I will see you next time.